visually people are given like very kind of strict kind of guidelines. This is what this brand should look like. But I guess was there anything in place for that for the BBC in terms of sound, or was it more about doing something that you thought would fit with the BBC?
I think looking at the original brief, which I've just kind of gone back and looked at today, just to sort of remind me, and I think even they weren't quite sure what they needed. They sort of talked about maybe creating a little music bed that went underneath some sounds that I think it's quite a tough ask, I think, to try and think, well, how do I try and make some sort of audio connect between 30 different idents, but make them all unique. So I ended up sort of touching on this notion of some shared elements, and then also some elements that were very unique. So I sort of we ended up settling on basically a bit of a chord that went from each ident. Sort of had a different little chord at the beginning of the ident, sort of very processed sounding sound, which is almost not even a chord. It was like a kind of a sound really that had some notes to it. And each ident had its own sort of unique sort of chord sound, like little two notes of sounds, depending on what the ident was doing. So each ident was very specific to a type of programming. So you had very dark, gritty idents, so sort of dark, gritty programming, like before Peaky Blinders, and then you had much sort of lighter, wonderful sounding, wonderful looking, nature based idents for sort of nature programs. So the sound needs to reflect those basically. And so we sort of ended up stumbling upon this idea of this sort of two notes, of this little chord that almost became the identity of the ident, which started each one, and then each one sort of ended up going into its own little world, and very much sort of using sounds and sort of creating them into musical ways, and then using instruments and making them a bit more abstract and sort of sound design, and processing them all in a very similar way. So using pitch changing and putting reverbs, putting them into big spaces, and lots of different ways of processing sounds. So even though they might be very different sounds for each different ident, they were sort of processed in similar ways and using similar techniques, and using bowing various instruments to try and make interesting sounds. So they all sort of, when they were played next to each other, they all sort of came together to sort of be very much a part of the same group of films, even though they're all sort of very different and very unique. And that was sort of a combination of that was kind of the plan, but also because we were doing them all at the same time and not a lot of time at all, so they kind of all had to be like it was almost an accident that they worked so well together, just because it was sort of using this concept of like, we want to make them really abstract, but really really want to be inside these environments, and in a sound way it can really help you to sort of convince you to be inside these little environments that you kind of want to visit. Kind of really help the movements, just all this movement that was happening on the screen with the twos and the different shapes. That was almost part of the sound in itself. So all the fact, the way we treated the movements and treated the sound, the way the movements, and all the movements were exactly the same through each ident. So there was a very strict timings for each ident, because of the reasons why they were using the idents and the junctions were using certain parts of the curve, and so it's called the curve. And so I'm terrible at explaining these kind of things, but so at certain points in each ident, at the exact second point there is an exact 2, which can then be matched to another ident in exactly the same point and exactly the same point. So each ident sort of had its own structure. So sound wise, it very much followed the visual structure, which was very similar from ident to ident. So you'd always sort of have a 2 or a shape which would then sort of go away and then come back. And I guess from sound point of view, you'd always have some sound which would sort of be more in focus and then be out of focus. And so it would sort of end up being quite similar just by nature of the fact you were sort of working with the visuals that were.
Yeah, so the visuals kind of had to hit sort of certain points that were the same
Yeah.
but at a certain point it was like that's what it would be at that point.
Yes, and then the idea, basically the idea of the animators made like a 43-second ident, which was then cut up into pieces so that when they had the 2-second versions and the 14-second version, the 7-second version, they would always work from the time code point of view.
Yeah.
And you could match it with any other ident at exactly the same time, and it would sort of be in the same place.